Hello, Ahmad. Hello, Tal. Welcome back for the part 2 of Infra Code on Azure with CARML. Welcome, guys.
Thanks
Good
for
to be
having
back.
us.
Yeah, last video, like if you are not following this channel, that's the Azure Tar channel. It's a tarball for Azure. It's everything that you want to learn about Azure development, now AI. On this second part, I think we're going a little bit deeper. We're going to see Tal is going to start and showing how we can create an overlay module using Bicep and using CARML. And then Ahmed is going to come and show us how to consume, not the module, but how to consume CARML, how to a simple demo, how you can use CARML-based modules. That sounds good? Now, you can start.
Yep.
Up to you. You can share your screen if you want.
So we'll put the link of the first part 1 in the description below, so you can find us. But here it is. Okay, I'm going to show how to develop your own in-house written modules that on top of CARML that has got all your business requirements and the security requirements built in. So one of the potential problem with CARML is that because it's very standardized, it will have a lot of pretty much all the configurations built in to the actual module. Like we use a storage account as example. If you look at the storage account CARML module, it has so many parameters that that configurable, which might be very confusing for your customer. And some of those configurations might not align with your internal security requirement. For example, if I allow share key access to be enabled, that might not align with the security requirement you have, because that, indeed it's not a very secure configuration. It's recommended to use Azure Auth. And also like public network access and for example, a lot of companies that we work for all have those disabled, and preferred method is using private endpoints. So if you offer the CARML module to your customer or your internal team that within your organization, people might get very confused, like exactly what do I need to do to actually have a storage account deployed, and which aligns with company security policies. So, for example, in my lab, I have all those. I have various security policies assigned to govern, to dictate how a storage account should be configured, right? So I'm restricting network access. I'm enforcing that the storage account must use custom key encryption. I'm you must disable shared key access. You have to have the minimum TOS version of 1.2, etc. So, but all those parameters are actually configurable if you use the CARML module. So what I have done is that I create a overlay module, so a custom or a standardized storage account module for your company, which is based on CARML. So in this demo repository, I have in the module folder, I have 2 folders, and I have the CARML folder, which contains just a copy, a straight copy from the CARML repo, a copy of the storage account modules from CARML, and then I create another folder called overlay, which is the in-house modified version of the storage account consuming the CARML module. So in this overlaid standard storage account module, I have built in all the internal requirements into this module. For example, because custom key encryption is required, so I'm making this a required parameter. And also that in an environment that I've worked in before, like all the private endpoints must have a statically assigned IP addresses. So we're making this we enable this capability in this module as well. That is easier for people to just say, okay, so I want a blob, create a blob and private endpoint for the blob or for the files services, and I can specify a private endpoint IP address. Because if you just look at the CARML module, it's not very obvious that how you can set them up.
So Tao, in this example,
yeah,
have you removed a lot of the parameters that you do not want?
Yes.
Like, for example, from a customer perspective, that you may not want to expose to your internal application teams.
That's right.
Right, and then you've hard coded those.
Yes.
Within the actual the space where you actually call the CARML module. So you provided a lot of hard coding in here. Okay.
Correct. So I'm calling the CARML module here. This is the path to the CARML module. And for example, I'm disabling the system assigned identity because I need to use a user assigned identity for authenticating to the keyboard for the CMK encryption. I'm disabling the shared key access. I'm disabling the network ACLs, so you can't actually create a VNet rule or whitelist any IPs. I'm disabling the cross-tenant replication. Double infrastructure encryption is set to true. And if you want to use a file service for the SMB protocol configurations, I've disabled those I've only allowed like more secure encryption algorithms. So the non-secure ones are disabled. I'm disabling SMB version 2, so only allow SMB 3 and 3.1. Minimum TOS versions is hard-coded to 1.2. If you want to enable SFTP, this is the configuration that, okay, so if you want to enable SFTP, you have to enable local users to create a user for SFTP. So I put in the logic here, say, if SFTP is enabled, regardless of what is set in this enable local user parameter, as long as you enable SFTP, you have to enable this, the local user. So we'll enable that. And also that your company might have a requirement say you can't use for SFTP, you can't use password. You have to use a SSH key. So the password is disabled. You must provide a SSH key or the public key for the SSH key to be set up for the SFTP local user. Public network access is disabled. Support HTTPS traffic only. Allow copy scope. Permitted scope is set to AAD, so you can't copy from a storage account in another AAD tenant. So I have all these hard-coded parameters based on my security requirement, but only surfaced what the customers are allowed to configure. In here, so and also like
you pretty much remove all the parameters that you're not going to allow.
Yes.
The consumer of the new module, of the module that you create on top of the CARML one.
Yeah.
Where you have like hard-coded or enforced parameters that you don't want to then to customize because you want to enforce those parameters.
Yep. And also, like for example, for the storage account, I think there are about 6 different private endpoints you can enable: blob, file, that data lake, table queue, and the static websites. But for example, I only want people to use a storage account like either blob or file storage or data lake. So I'm not actually have parameters for other type of private endpoints you can create for the storage account. And all you need to do is say, okay, so if I need a file, I need a private endpoint for the file service, and just specify the name, and then we'll have the logics to build the payload for that particular private endpoint.
I think what
passing to the module.
What's also critical here is that this is not a preventative control per se from a policy and governance perspective. This is essentially, simplifying the developer experience, or whoever needs to deploy those modules, so that they are guided towards the path that is preferred in terms of deployment. Customers would still require the development of Azure policies that essentially map out to those certain requirements that you've enforced here. So, like, for example, you've mentioned that you've disabled SMB 2.0, for example, right? So this means that if you're disabling it here, it should also be accompanied by an Azure policy on the actual Azure side to actually enforce it there. Because if people, for example, take on those modules and then they go in and actually modify the hard-coded values, they also want to be restricted by an Azure policy at the same time.
Yeah, so Azure policy and your module development should go hand in hand. So you have your security requirements that you need to codify as Azure policies, and also that as people say that a lot right now, there is a shift left, right? So you have a version of your module, the reusable code, that absolutely align with your security requirement, and also your Azure policy. So Azure policy is absolutely crucial. That once what I have here is that when you at the deployment time, we make sure that they are out of the box, they are aligning with your Azure policy. But after it's deployed, those settings are not governed by this piece of code anymore, right? It's like you build a car, you already driven that out of the dealer, and then you own your own. But then Azure policy is in place to make sure that it's continuously compliant with your security requirements.
One thing
I think it's a preference sometimes, because we're discussing here, like, if you have the policy, why we hard coding the things? Because they're not going to be able to create, because the policy is already blocking that. Is that the question?
No, I think it's so. What I've seen as well happen is, if people are not aware of the policies and they think they could just go in and get any Azure storage module or configuration from the internet, they deploy it and then it fails. They fix something else and it fails. They fix another thing and it fails. So in order to make sure that they get the best experience, you need to provide them with the path towards successful deployments. And those modules, essentially, whether they're published, whether they're an inner source library, they need to kind of help simplify and improve on that developer experience. The most important thing, I think, as well, is the documentation. So whenever you're publishing your own inner source module, like whether it's an overlay or the standard CARML one, it's really important that to kind of leverage. There's sections in the documentation. The one that CARML generates is there's a section called parameter usage, and that parameter usage section essentially is allows the CARML developers to provide descriptions and an example of how to actually use the particular parameter in order to get a successful deployment. So like Tao, if you go to the basic CARML modules, you'll see that there's just pick any like storage account or anything else. In the README file, if you click on the README file, you'll see that there's a section called deployment examples. So in here, some of them have deployment usage. Here it is, parameter usage. So if you look at the private endpoint section, it actually shows a JSON, version of what a successful deployment looks like using that particular parameter. And it also has the Bicep version of that as well. If customers who want to use a parameter file that is a JSON parameter file, or they want to embed it inside another Bicep module, they could use the Bicep version of this. And there's an example section in the top, the end of this document essentially shows a full end-to-end example of a usage of, of an actual deployment. So the inner source or the overlay needs to actually align to that same principles that are used within the CARML to actually provide that experience to developers, and they publish those documentation as well.
Yes. Yeah. So what I want to show is that, there's also another Microsoft open source project from our friend Bernie White called PS Docs. So what I've been using is, for the overlay module that I've created, also have this. Sorry, not this one. The overlay module has also got this README file, which is generated not within the same script as what CARML uses, but there's a PowerShell module called PSDoc. We use that. I use that to generate this file. This README file basically contains, what parameters requires for each, for consuming this module, so that you can leverage that as well. In the utility folder, I create a script here called generate template readme using PSDoc. So basically, you can, what I do is I just point that to a directory, and then scan through all the Bicep files and then generate readmes for that. The only requirements it needs is a metadata.json file that just have these 3 fields, like display name, description, summary. So you create that next to the Bicep, your Bicep file, and then we'll just go and generate a README file in the same directory. So that's how I do it. If you're looking for a alternative method, yeah. So I talked about the overlay module. To consume the overlay module, I've got this demo template, which I deploy. I look up a existing subnet in the VNet, right? For the private endpoints, I deploy a key vault using the CARML module, because there's not many customization required for key vault. I'm happy just to use the CARML module. You can create a key vault with private endpoints, and then I'll create a storage account using overlay. The reason I'm creating a key vault is I need to use a key vault to store the CMK encryption key, right? So, yeah. So I'm just pointing that to the key vault resource ID. Yeah. So that's this template shows you how to consume both CARML module as well as your the overlay module I've created in one single template. Yeah, that's my demo. I'll make this after the recording. I'll make this repo public, and we have the URL of this repo in the video description.
Like consulting, yep, CARML demo.
Yep.
That sounds good. That sounds good. I think the message is, in my opinion, yeah, if you have to, you have the option to extend. In this case, do we have to have the code inside there, or I can just have a reference for the code? Well,
you can reference it. Like I have a like just to make my life easier for this demo, I copied it in the same repo. But if you publish somewhere else, like in a private repo, like in a Bicep registry, you can reference that as well.
Reference that as well. Sounds good.
Yeah.
And you can use the version specifically. You're extending a specific version.
So you could publish, yeah. So like, if you think about it, you can actually publish the entire module CARML base as it is into your Bicep registry or your template specs, and then publish an overlay in another repository that actually references the CARML ones as well, right? So so that your essentially your overlay doesn't actually have to have local modules inside the same repository. You could still always refer to the ones that you've published in your in your library. But obviously, if you don't want your internal customers to actually use the CARML baseline ones, you wouldn't expose that registry to them or those template specs to them. You would expose only your published versions in another Bicep registry, for example, that is more, internal customer facing.
Because the service principal or the identity use must need to have access to pull the modules right from the Bicep registry. So
or read access to the resource group. So like I could give an example here from a customer implementation where they've created starter for 10 templates for developers to kind of get up to speed in deploying a container app or a key vault or a storage account. So what they've done basically is that they've provided they created inside a subscription, a resource group, some template specs, and they've had an Azure AD group where they enrolled all the developers into that Azure AD group that has permissions as reader for that template spec library. And essentially, those developers had access to those template specs as read, so they can only consume the content that's coming out of it, whatever version that they wanted. But still allowed them to be more they could go into their IDEs on their desktops and just reference to those template specs easily and just deploy their versions on top of it. So
that sounds good. And if you can share your screen, Ahmad, you can maybe show where once you have this module developed by like Tao did, if you want to make this module part of the CI/CD that you deploy the modules and you test, where exactly we have to change, or you have to create a new pipeline and you test.
Yep. So give me a second. I'll share my screen.
And you also have a demo to show us quickly how to running, like how to create, how to consume CARML.
Yeah. So I'll just quickly show here on the repo side, not from VS Code, but it's exactly the same experience. So let's say
can you make the font bigger? Sorry.
I can't. Yep, sorry. Okay. So essentially, in this, like I'm just inside the modules folder, essentially in the repository. So assume that I am going to be authoring a new version of automation accounts, right? So in here, in this structure, we have the different folders for the module essentially. So that main.bicep essentially is your actual main Azure automation account deployment module. The test folder here is where it contains your different scenarios, right? So in this example, how CARML does it is that we have different folders. They target different test use cases. So for example, we have a common here folder which contains most of the parameter combinations that you could add to a particular deployment. Encryption, for example, this one I think uses CMK. Min is actually the one that has the minimum modules that are required to actually do a deployment. So if we take this exact same structure and apply it to an overlay module, so let's say someone goes in and creates modules, automation, customer X automation accounts. So if they take the exact same folder in here, that main.bicep is in this folder here will no longer reference the actual the same structure here, like the same actual Azure automation module. It will actually reference the CARML published version. However, in the test section, they would have to go in and create their own different folders in here, exactly in that same place, where they go in and say, test case A. Maybe they create a folder called test case A and just give it a name saying, complete, all parameters. Test case B, one with private endpoints. Test case C, one that deploys an automation account with, 2 variables. With test case D, one that uses user-assigned managed identities. So they could develop their own test cases. Exactly.
Can you open one? Can you
I'll open one. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So and inside here is in the CARML design, we have a folder. We have a file called dependencies.bicep, and we have the main.test.bicep. And essentially, the dependencies.bicep, essentially what it means is that deploy me all the dependencies that are needed for me to deploy my test module. An example here would be if you're deploying up, let's say, an automation account that uses user-assigned identities, obviously the user assigned identities is not part of the automation account. It's a dependency. It's another Azure resource. So what you do basically in your dependencies, you go in and and deploy a managed identity or a virtual network or whatever resources that you would actually need for you to successfully test your module. So once you kind of have those dependencies, so the CARML CI actually reads this file first, right? So the CARML CI goes in, and for every module deployment in the test folder, so it's for each, it will go in and say, deploy the dependencies.bicep, and it will deploy it in its own isolated resource group. And once this is done, essentially, it will go in and now deploy the main.test.bicep. And well, actually, you know what? I think I have made a mistake here. Sorry. So what we'll actually do, it will actually deploy the main.bicep, the main.test.bicep, but the dependencies.bicep essentially is referenced as a child module inside this. So if you see it here, so the main.bicep, so the CARML CI actually, sorry about that. The main.bicep gets deployed first, and in here it will reference the dependencies.bicep that were sitting outside. And it will, give it a virtual network name, a key vault name, a managed identity in this case. And then it will actually go in and deploy the main module. So this is your actual main automation account customer A, something that you had. But notice that it will actually reference those dependencies. So whatever that's coming out of the dependencies deployment here, like diagnostic dependencies in this case, it will actually refer to them as outputs, so that you could actually construct the entire payload required to actually successfully test your module deployment. So essentially what happens in summary, the CARML CI goes and reads the main.test.bicep, and this is where I made a mistake and it says deploys dependencies first. It does deploy it first, but it actually deploys it right from the main.test.bicep. And then it goes in, and once this is done, it deploys the main actual test, the test phase of the module. So once this is all done and it's actually successful, so what happens is the actual CARML CI will go in and actually delete the deployment. So it will actually first start deleting. There's a delete phase inside the CI testing phase, where it actually goes in and it starts deleting the resources one by one, and it also deletes the dependencies, and it deletes the entire resource group, and it will also publish this entire module, into whether your target Bicep registry, template spec, or your Azure DevOps artifacts.
Okay, then means that's more like an integration test, but you're not checking, like once you create, there is no like testing to check if the thing was really created, but just like it's pretty much running the module. This one.
It will test the deployment. Yes. So it will test the deployment with all the dependencies and all the requirements that you have. So example, if you've provided an indirect role, resource ID for a particular path inside your module, that will obviously fail the deployment in a way. If you provided a string in a place that needs an integer, that will fail. Like whatever the actual parameters that are required to successfully test the module, it will actually get validated. So it won't get published until those tests complete. And it's not a test where you actually go in and say, okay, the automation account was deployed using public network access disabled with a private endpoint. Let me do an NS lookup and check the IP address of the automation account endpoint. No, it's not going to do that. It's actually just testing the infrastructure as code bit.
Okay.
And I do want to mention. Yes, I do want to mention here that we also, like before the deployment phase, there's also code scan using PS rules. So if anything that's out of standard, no secure configuration, PS rule should pick them up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my next question. If CARML is already calling PS rule or not.
It is.
Think they are.
Yes, so okay. CARML, so we've recently integrated with PS rule for checking. Yep. However, we've still set it to audit mode at this stage. So we're essentially exposing the outputs that come inside the CI, that are generated inside the CI, to say, I don't know, any tags don't exist or something is not configured based on a security requirement. but we're not enforcing it at the moment. But we've started up, that phase of building, PS rule directly into the CARML CI system.
Sounds good. And once it's tested, there's a Bicep, there's a GitHub workflow there.
So once the deployments are tested and the deployments are successful, what happens is the actual CARML CI will now publish to your target publishing environment. So you could publish to a Bicep registry, you could publish to a template spec or an Azure artifact. And if I just quickly go back to the settings.yaml here. So in here, you could actually have some additional customizations on, on certain things that you have in your own CI. So, if, like, for example, in CARML, we use the token prefix and the suffix as default. Some customers may want to do, I don't know, __ or something else in terms of how do they translate a specific token that needs to be replaced. And, the agent settings. So there's certain settings as well for Azure DevOps only around the service connection type. Now, this is also some settings kind of like feature flags, so that you can actually use to say template spec do publish, right? And this will target your template specs. If you, like in your own CI, if you don't want to use template specs, you could actually set this to false. So a lot of those settings here are customizable, based on tailored to what customers want in their environment.
Yeah, like the region is probably one thing that probably most customer would want to customize. It's very common to have security policies that you can only deploy resources in, we are in Australia, so in Australia regions. So you might want to set that to a region that's allowed by your security team as well. Like also the Bicep registry name, that's got to be a name, the Bicep registry that your company owns in your tenant, right? So.
So as an example here, notice that in my own version of CARML, I set the Bicep registry name to my own Bicep registry because I want to publish to my own Bicep registry. Excuse me. So this is the published side, right? So as you can see, these are all the different modules that I have published in my own CI. So I don't have the full CARML modules published because I only wanted a handful of them for my testing. But you could actually target them all if you like. So in here, this is the Bicep registry. So if I look at those repositories, I could see what I've published from modules. So I've only published the Bastion, for example, in this case, and those are the different versions that I could use. But on the other hand, the template specs is where I'm going to be doing a demo soon. And essentially, I'm going to leverage those published modules, that version of availability sets, for example, or some other module to actually deploy a particular architecture type.
Can you also show where you can change the version number?
The version number on the template,
in Bicep registry, those.
Yes, so I'll show it in the actual VS Code when I show the actual implementation. Yeah. Okay, so shall we go into the demo?
Yeah, let's go for the demo.
All right. Okay. Cool. So essentially, what I've done basically, I've put something in a public repository called CARML demo under my name, and in here I've essentially just developed a small architecture that uses CARML modules to kind of build out a particular design, and I'll go through this in a bit more detail now. But this essentially has a walkthrough of the components that this repository deploys, the deployment stage, how to deploy, and how to do the testing that we want to be doing part of this deployment. So essentially, the design does the following. And so I would like to, and this is just for demonstration. So in this design, I am going to be deploying 2 resource groups inside a subscription. The first resource group contains what I call a core resource group. And in this resource group, there's going to be a virtual network. And in this virtual network, I'm going to have 2 subnets. One's called a workload subnet and one's called a Bastion subnet. I'm also going to be deploying an Azure Bastion instance with a public IP address inside this Bastion subnet. And I'm also going to be creating a private DNS zone for Azure Key Vaults and I'm going to do a network link integration into the virtual network so that I could essentially resolve private IP addresses for key vaults. And then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be deploying this workload resource group. And in this workload resource group, I'm going to deploy a virtual machine with a system assigned identity and obviously a network interface. And I'm also going to be deploying an Azure Key Vault with a private endpoint that's actually going to be sitting inside this workload subnet. And what I'm going to do also is I'm going to essentially bind this private endpoint to the DNS zone. So using the DNS zone group as a parameter. And I'm also going to be doing a role assignment for this system identity to actually access this Key Vault using the Key Vault secrets officer role, essentially all to be happening behind private endpoints. So this is just kind of to demonstrate how I could use those, CARML Lego building blocks essentially to actually construct this solution. Any questions before I drill into it?
No, sounds good. I think there's a few modules that we're going to use: virtual machine, Key Vault,
yeah, there's a handful of modules.
Bastions, a few modules.
Yeah,
Public IP.
Public IPs. Yeah. So essentially, this is kind of the repository that I've just shown. So in here, I have my solution, which is my main.bicep, and I have two child modules. So I have my core, which deploys my core resource group, and my workload, which deploys my virtual machine and my Key Vault. So in this core, the first thing I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to be deploying a resource group, an empty resource group.
Can you do Control plus, just to be a little bit big?
Okay.
Control plus, yep, there you go, better, thanks.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. So essentially what I'm going to be doing, I think what matters in this demo here is the method of me using, what is the method I'm using to actually build those components, and is that through template spec? Is that local? Is that through Bicep registry? And notice here I'm using the template spec feature of module deployment inside Bicep. What I'm saying here, template spec, core specs, and this is just me how I've structured it, and then resource groups, resources modules, resources folder, sorry, and then resource groups. And then I'm going to be using the latest. So there's a bicep.config here, which is part of this, Bicep configuration file. And this is where I've went in and said, my template spec, core specs, this is my subscription, okay, my alias, and this is my resource group that I want to be using. This is only to help me just simplify the terminology of how I reference my template specs, right? So if I could, for example, come here and say, subscription ID, put my subscription ID, and then put my resource group name, right? And then I will be able to reference that template spec component inside my template spec library.
And you can do the same for the
Bicep registry.
Bicep registry as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So in here, I'm essentially using my alias, my core specs alias, and I'm pointing towards my template spec, which is called resources, resource group, and I'm using the latest version. And this is the version section that Tao has mentioned. So if I go back here, if I go to my artifacts RG, if I do resources.resource groups, oops, where is it? Resources.resource groups. Here it is. So I'm using resources.resource groups latest. Okay, which is this. It's kind of a tag in a way. So, and that's the first component. So I'm deploying my resource group. And actually what I want to do is, let me just trigger off the deployment because this will take a bit of time so that I could actually just spend the time explaining it while actually being deployed. Just one moment.
An ideal is to have like a version number using latest there, but real life just have version 1, version 2, 0.1, 0.2.
Yeah. So there's different mechanisms of how you can use versioning, and they're all inside the Bicep documentation. I hope I could remember the password I just created because I was talking while I was creating it. So, well, we'll find out soon. Anyways, so yeah, so the first thing this is going to be doing is that it's actually going to deploy the resource group, and then it's going to deploy an NSG for the Azure Bastion with a whole bunch of NSG rules. So I've essentially, protected my Azure Bastion behind NSG rules. And then all I'm using here is CARML modules. So there's no overlay. I'm just using the vanilla version of those CARML modules. But the overlay essentially is exactly the same method in this case. So I'm then deploying another NSG on another subnet, and then I'm deploying my virtual network that I just talked about with this address space with 2 subnets. And then I'm providing the network security group ID as an output from the NSG modules. So the first one here, which is the NSG Bastion, I'm using the output of this module. And I'm referencing the resource ID because we are outputting those parameters, those parameters from the modules. And then I'm going to be deploying a public IP for my Azure Bastion, and I'm using my public IP modules. And then I'm giving it some properties, and then I'm going to be deploying my Azure Bastion with some properties as well. And this is the public IP that I wanted to use with it as well. And then I'm going to deploy a private DNS zone for Azure Key Vault, give it a name. I don't want to use registration, and I want to use this virtual network for integration. So all this stuff is pretty much out of the box with CARML. And then I'm just going to output some stuff here. Now, a common challenge I've seen is that how do I know what those modules actually need in terms of parameters? Like, will I be able to just, how would I actually, like, does it need a name? Does it, like this virtual network links, how do I know this is part of this module, essentially? So when you're using something with Bicep, essentially you could actually point Bicep to tell you to print out the required modules based on the required parameter if they don't have default values inside the modules themselves, the actual template. The other thing that's most important, I think, in my opinion, is the documentation. So you need to have, like, if you're publishing modules to your internal developer community or, infrastructure engineers and others, you need to accompany this with a proper documentation. And then the documentation, you have to use, like, you can use the CARML documentation, for example, because in this case, I'm just using the vanilla module. But once you're publishing stuff internally, you could have your internal kind of SharePoint site or internal repo or GitHub, environment that goes in and, provides guidance as a wiki to show this is the module path, this is the README for it, so that when developers are actually authoring something on their IDEs, they know how to construct those parameters, similar to what I'm doing here.
Yeah, like, this is a very same as previously when Jorge and I worked with Terraform Enterprise, where they publish the module there is exactly the same. Like you have a Git repo with all the READMEs. But in terms of in VS Code, if you log into Azure, in VS Code, and you point that to a template spec or to a Bicep module publishing module registry, actually the IntelliSense will prompt you for the required parameters as well.
Oh, okay. So is that here? I didn't know where that would be. Maybe you can show us this.
Yeah, you need to first. I can't show it in my environment, but you need to have the Azure accounts
okay.
VS extension installed, and then once you log into to Azure in VS Code, it will automatically prompt you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I'll go to the second one.
Template spec, Ahmad. The template spec is not also showing the JSON. It's not going to give you like a documentation from the Azure portal. I don't think it can.
It can. No, it can absolutely. So with let's say I'm going to go the latest. If I click on this latest version, I could click on the main template and I could actually see it, right? So, however, I think what although it
depends on at the bottom, like it depends on what the last thing is that depends on. Then you can see some dependencies on the one.
But the thing is, this is a better view in the Bicep registry in a way because you get to see the template, right? But what the challenge is, this is machine generated code, and then the way the readability is different to traditional ARM templates that were authored by developers. They were just always simplified in a way and made it was easy for people to read. This one, I think, since we're now relying on the compilation process to convert the Bicep into a JSON template, which then gets published, that is machine generated code, and hence it might be a bit difficult for a lot of people who don't know how to use JSON. So that's why the documentation is the key place where people need to have a much better experience in understanding how to interact with those modules.
Yeah, I personally, like in the customers environment right now, that I'm consuming internally published CARML modules, and I personally prefer just, that's my personal preferences, just reading in the repo, the ADO internal repo, where the replica of CARML code is just read there. So I know exactly what parameters are required.
So the other child module here essentially is my workload, and all I'm doing is I am providing an input to a secure parameter for my virtual machine password. I'm doing a resource group. I'm deploying my Azure Key Vault, and I'm deploying my virtual machine into that into that subnet that essentially that we just provisioned in the previous template. So what I've done basically is I've then combined those two in the main.bicep, which I've just triggered here. The first one deploys the module's core, and the second one deploys the module's resource group. And it's still cooking, but I'll quickly go to the resource group and see what we have. So yeah, so the first thing is it's still, I think, deploying the Azure Bastion in this case. So let's have a look and see what's being deployed. Yep, essentially it's the Azure Bastion. So hopefully when this one completes, it will now start off deploying the other resource group, which is the workload resource group. So yeah, like I think if customers would want to be using the Bicep registry instead of the template spec, they could easily swap this to BR and then configure a similar configuration for the Bicep config to actually have an alias section to actually simplify the naming terminology that's used to author Bicep templates or Bicep registry deployments. Now, what is it required for developers to actually have access to those template specs? Like in my case here, I have everything in one subscription, but from a developer experience, these resources may not be in the same subscription where they're actually targeting the actual deployment. So it's important from an RBAC perspective that you provide your consumers through your RBAC model or your IAM controls access to those template specs so that they actually have read access to this resource group so that they can actually do those deployments. This is if you want to use the template spec version. If you want to use the Bicep registry version, I think there's another RBAC model.
I think it's the ACR pool.
Yeah. ACR pool probably. Yeah. So you still need to assign the an Azure role for your developers to be able to actually read content from this Bicep registry compared to the template spec. It's just
also the pipeline will need to have access, same access as well. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, that's for the publishing. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yep. So yeah, like for like RBAC is usually sometimes that is overlooked. So just make sure that you're actually providing the right IAM governance to your developers. So through your IAM controls and tools, because if developers, for example, no longer need roles, they need to be taken out from groups so they don't have access to these repos anymore, and so forth. Okay, so this one's now complete. So now we have our Azure Bastion. Let's quickly have a look at our workload. Actually, what I was actually interested in, if I were to go quickly look at my total deployment time for this demo. So we're running about 10 minutes now.
Yeah, bashing takes
a while.
Yep.
Yep.
You
So I
could
just
have
want to
picked
get
a easier resource like storage account.
well,
Before before that finished, like one thing for people to understand how that works, exactly what you did, you create a repo, you consume your modules, you reference modules, and now something changed. After this deployment, you want to change something. Is like normal infra is as code as you are used to using Terraform or Bicep or JSON. And because you have version control, means if there is a new version for like key vault from CARML, you can just use the latest version. If you're not using the latest, you could be using a specific version. Depends on how you treat version.
Yeah.
And you don't have
in
to
CARML,
update.
like for each module, the main.bicep, next to the main.bicep file, there's a version.json. I think if I remember correctly, that's how the customer can use that to define the version number, which is going to be published to the Bicep registry.
Yeah,
just
100%.
because there is a new version doesn't mean that we have to use the new version, unless we need some new features, some new things.
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where, for example, this section here, you go and modify it to the version that you want to be deploying. Like I've chosen latest in this example, but essentially, let's say this is inside source control. You've published this, and then now you want to, let's say the team who maintains your Bicep modules internally published a new version of storage account that now includes a property to disable cross-tenant replication, for example, right? A feature in storage account. So, or they hard-coded this based on a security requirement. So, part of your comms or your change control, your teams could go in and say, I'm going to use now version 1.0, for example, if it's published, and then that way, or version 1.1, whatever the mechanism that you're using internally, and then that way you could actually benefit from the latest feature, and then just come into your module and say, I don't know, cross-tenant replication equals false, for example, or whatever other feature that it may be a requirement.
Hey, that's a opportunity for automation that in ACR you can have webhooks, right? So you can probably build some automation to automatically notify people when a new version of something's been updated or changed or published.
So
yeah, pretty much that. And okay, still created that.
Okay, so our virtual machine is created. I honestly don't know if what I'm about to put in terms of the password is right or wrong, so we'll just find out.
You can always reset it.
I know, but I don't want to deal with that right now.
See if you type in the right password.
VM run command is the best.
Looks good so far.
Yeah, I think we're in. Cool.
There you go.
All right, so this is exactly, this VM was deployed with no public IP addresses, right? So it's all behind an Azure Bastion. And this key vault was deployed as well with disabled network access, with a private endpoint here, provisioned into that workload subnet. Exactly.
What's the key vault for again? Is that for disk encryption or is it storing the password?
No, this is just a key vault. Essentially, I'm just going to go in and create a secret in it using the private path. Essentially,
okay. So it's not related to the VM deployment.
No, it's not. So essentially, what I'm going to be doing. So actually, yeah. So this one. So what the instance that I've chosen for this VM is an actual. The image is a Visual Studio 2022 on top of Windows 2022. And the reason I chose this for this demo is because I have some Azure modules already installed on those machines by default. And interestingly, they still come with the Azure RM modules, right? So they don't come with the AZ ones. So so if I come in here, I think the first thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing an add Azure RM account. So
I think that Azure RM is probably just an alias now.
No, I couldn't. So add
No, hold on.
AZ,
Just
I
go GCM git command.
can't. Yeah, hang on. We'll find out.
If it's the latest PowerShell module, yes. We just
Yeah. So if you do get
GCM git command. Yeah.
I think it's going to pop up with RM. So it's all the classic modules and stuff like that. So they're quite old. But that doesn't matter. I think for our use case, it still works. So
you're logging in
I'm logging with
manage identity of the VM.
Manage identity of the VM.
Yeah.
And then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to retrieve the Azure Key Vault that I just created. So just give me a second, I got a call. I'll copy this correctly. So let me open that up. That's my Azure Key Vault. Because I've given the VM an Azure role, which is a secrets officer, so I do have access to the data plane of this Azure Key Vault.
Yep.
And what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to actually, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do an NS lookup, all right, to get the IP address of this Azure Key Vault.
Yeah, it's private IP.
And notice that it's the private IP that we've just deployed. So that proves that the path from this VM to this Azure Key Vault is going to go by the private network. So what I'm going to be doing next is actually I'm going to be reading a host to create a secure string. So why is this copy not working? Okay, so I'm going to, since we're reading a host, and I'm going to say CARML demo yay. Okay. And so I've stored this inside this variable here, which is a secure string variable. And now I'm going to set this variable on the Azure Key Vault. So, oh man. Okay. So what we've just done, we've written a secret to this Azure Key Vault, and we've called the secret name test secret. And that's the confirmation that we did there. So the second thing I'm going to be doing is actually going to retrieve the secret. So I don't think it copied, but I'll try. I don't know, it's not working. So I'm just going to do a get AZ Key Vault secret, and I'm going to give it the Key Vault name and the secret name, and I'm just going to display the value in plain text. And here you go. So that's essentially the demo. So what we have here is this virtual machine and interacting with an Azure Key Vault behind a private endpoint, accessible, this VM is accessible through Azure Bastion for management, and no internet, essentially, no access from the public internet.
That sounds good. That simplifies a lot. If you use the module is tested. There's all this framework behind the CARML, and you'll be safer than you try to consume, modules directly. Because even CARML, we have like some default values on the module as well.
Yeah.
You are enforcing some default values.
Yes. So if I come back to my module, notice here I'm not selecting a lot of stuff inside the modules. Like in Azure Bastion, there's a lot more components to this. So this is like, there's a diagnostic one. There is sharing, I think, enable shareable link, and then this is a true false, value. So
let's call that more. You have some smart defaults there. I mean, let's call it smart defaults or default values and.
Yeah, so we do have this concept of secure defaults as well on a lot of the modules. So we try to enforce some level of best practices in a way, but it just depends on customer environments. Some of those could require features that have to be explicitly enabled on subscriptions as well. Like I think infrastructure encryption on virtual machines or hypervisor encryption on virtual machines does require like additional features that needs to be enabled on the subscription. So it's sometimes hard to do everything, but we do try to kind of at least set some best practices in a lot of the parameters.
Sounds good.
And that's it.
Oh, any questions?
Yeah.
My question is,
I think it was.
should we do a part 3?
Oh yeah, I think we have to come back for part 3, and Tao has to show now the module with testing and being deployed.
It's getting hardcore.
Otherwise, people are going to send you a message asking, "How can I do it?"
Or leaving to the viewers, well, what else you want to see in CARML or in Bicep? Maybe in the comments whether we should do a part 3 or not.
I agree. We already had some customers already reaching out, and they watched the part 1. They want to see this part now, and hopefully have another one. Let's think about what's next, and let us know. Comment out on this video and let us know what you want.
Or
next.
if you are currently using CARML in your organization, we can probably look at, like, you're happy to talk to us. We can probably, from another angle, like looking at how customers are using CARML in the organization. That could be a good topic for part 3, but we need to. Yeah.
If there's any customer that's already using CARML watching these and want to be part of this next presentation, you can join us and ask authorization for your company, and then maybe you can show what you're doing with CARML. But thank you, Tao, thank you, Ahmad, and
no worries.
We'll be back on next video. Thanks a lot. It was amazing Cheers again. Tao is enjoy the evening.
I only have one glass, so I'm not drunk yet.
And don't forget to subscribe the channel to get the notification for this video for the next one.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And
thank you.
See you later.
Lovely.
All right.
Great.